All right, folks, you know the drill. Friday, block party, DFS show with Jmtowin from 1 week season. We're going to do a slate overview, see what we're looking at here with this week 13 DFS slate. Then we'll go position by position, our top GPP plays at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end. And then we'll wrap up by building a lineup on DraftKings with some of JM's favorite building blocks. It's the block party. I'm Pete. Let's do it.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go.
I got auto match with Levitan. Bullshit.
I just go the other way. In that 66, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
AP, 35 bullets in your head like KD. Bust it, bitch, go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey, everyone.
All right, JM still broadcasting from what looks like just a quintessential log cabin. Is that the case, JM?
Yeah, I believe this is real wood behind me. The antler lamp in front of me is not real antlers. Definitely some cheap plastic antler-looking structure. But yeah, another week, another log cabin, another block party show. By the way, I was laughing as we came on air so I told you right before we came on, I restarted Chrome for the first time all season, and like I just thought, that'd clear things out, speed up my computer. Everything disappeared. So just looking up here, one of my bookmarks is Fantasy Draft, which hasn't existed for like 3 years. So everything reset to like 3 years ago.
You're like in an old Chrome profile, like
yeah,
that.
I don't know. I logged into my Chrome profile. And I went to like reload my history of like all my research tabs. Everything's missing. All my login stuff's missing. So I'm like slowly rebuilding up my profile of research tabs and login information.
That's brutal. Do you have, because there is something in Chrome where you can like reopen the old your history. Do you have that available to you? Yeah.
And I'm like logged into my typical Chrome account. I have my typical avatar up in the front right, but that's not working. So yeah, everything's strange. I just tried to log into Twitter. That didn't work. Sorry, X. That didn't work. But yeah, I'll figure it all out, and we'll get a good week going.
You're gonna have to be like Cal says. The sims and the projections are just in his head. That's what you're gonna have to be.
There is some research that goes into creating those sims in your head, but maybe I'll just do it blind this week. No, I've done most of my research already. Just trying to write up the player grid and try to pull some stats, and I was like, well, now I got to go open up all these tabs all over again. So yeah, that's my life right now.
All right. This is what I'm hearing is this is JM's flu game. He is about to, see the entire board, put the puzzle pieces together without his usual resources.
I like it. Let's do it.
Real quick, as always, week 12. It's like such a blur now. I can barely even remember what was last week, but did you have a good week in week 12?
No, which is crazy. Last week was the Josh Allen, Pat Fryermuth, Kyren Williams week. And no, it was, I was down like 20% ROI. And then if, Josh and Gabe Davis connected on that touchdown, would have been at profit, but somehow finished down like 50%, which was crazy. But it was, I don't know. It's like the third or fourth time this year I've said this, but it was like one of the best OWS weeks ever. So we took down the slant for the third time this year. Took down the flea flicker, second place in the Millie Maker, 8th place in the Millie Maker. Bunch of other like top 5 finishes in the Wildcat. Actually had 6 OWS pennants in the top 10 in the slant from 5 different users. So love seeing that. Wow. But yeah, it was a great week for the OWS fam. It was one of those really weird to finish the week not at profit, but sometimes everything just doesn't line up on one roster, so we turn the page and we move on. I've had some weeks over the last couple of years that were really profitable and weren't my best weeks. This last week was like one of my best weeks and just wasn't profitable. So it swings both ways, but you play long enough, it all evens itself out.
I know we don't talk about like ownership projections a ton. I know sometimes I'll be like, oh, this guy's going to be super popular. And you're going to be like, oh, that's news to me. But one of the big talking points in the industry this week was how far off ownership projections were last week. There were some players that, were coming 20% higher. Derrick Henry, JT came in way lower than we envisioned. Did you have any thoughts on kind of that macro dynamic from last week?
Wasn't Jonathan Taylor still like 30% owned?
He was like 15% in a lot of my stuff.
Okay. It must have been some high dollar stuff. I was looking at that he was 30% still in those. Yeah. So somebody asked about that in the Winner Circle podcast this week. And one of the things I said, so we have a an announcement channel on Discord that when there's new content, we post it in there. So you can get the notification when new content is posted. And sometimes when Xandomir updates the ownership projections, he'll have a note in there on like what he's doing with ownership. And so there is kind of this rubber band effect of you can't stray too far from what all the other sites are doing. And so there were a few places this last week where Xandomir like artificially bumped up Josh Allen, artificially bumped down Jonathan Taylor, and left a note when he updated ownership saying, I just can't see the field being dumb enough to play Jonathan Taylor at 30%, or I can't see Josh Allen being below 10%, but there's still like that rubber band effect of how far you can pull that. So I think one of the things you have to think about is there is an I know better component that Xandomir, I think, is really good. So if you're an OWS sub and you use our ownership course, I think a lot of us look at a lot of different sites, right? But if you just use OWS, Xandomir is going to have this component of like, I know better than what the optimizers are showing, the projections are showing, what other sites are saying. And so I'm going to kind of go in this direction, but there's only so far you can go in that direction. So you kind of have to have that sense on your own too, of being able to say, okay, well, I know even better than that, right? Like there's only a certain extent to which this Josh Allen ownership can be pushed, or this Derrick Henry, I think probably surprised people a little bit, but the Panthers, I just thought people were down enough on Derrick Henry that wouldn't be where it was. But it's one of those things, right? It's not a perfect science. And I think that all this, ETR does a great job. FTN does a great job. RG does a great job. OWS does a great job. Like it's incredible what these guys are able to do in terms of getting close on ownership projections, but there's going to be those weeks where things are just off. And that affects, depending on style of play, that affects certain players more than others. But for me, obviously, like I just need to know who's popular and who's not. And that's just like a secondary part of my roster building process as well.
Yeah, and I think that the kind of the takeaway for me, and I made this mistake way more last year, which was getting locked into ownership stuff far too early in the week before I settled on the actual plays I wanted to play. And I'm basically out leveling myself. Oh, everyone's doing this, so I'm going to zig over here. And then when that's wrong, then you've really kind of outsmarted yourself into suboptimal plays. And so, this week, like, it's like, I really wanted to play Derrick Henry. I talked with you. I felt the steam. I know he's going to be more popular, but it's like, I like the lineups. I didn't think it was a bad play, even at slightly increased ownership. And I just let it ride. And yeah, it's not ideal that he came in, 10% over what he was projected, but it's like a good play is a good play. There were other ways to still build smart lineups around that.
Yeah. And Scott Barrett was texting me last night to pick my brains about Zack Moss and Tyreek Hill and how to handle their ownership this week. So I'll go ahead and read really quickly one of the things I said. And so this is obviously everybody handles DFS differently. So this is just how I approach it, but this might resonate with some of you in terms of, okay, I can approach things this way. What I said to him was, I don't usually start worrying too much about the strategy side until Friday night or Saturday night. If I start on that too early, I can cloud my thoughts on the raw plays. Like think too much about strategy on Mostert versus the Panthers with no Achane, no Jeff Wilson. You end up getting cute and going underweight instead of being like, F it, I'm all in. And so then you kind of have to think about like, how these guys line up in your minds first. And we'll talk about Tyreek Hill and Zack Moss, obviously on the show, because those are key points on this week's slate. But there's like a component first that to me, you got to think about how you want to play those guys before you worry too much about the ownership. And then, like you said, if you latch onto that ownership too early, you start thinking strategy and it takes out that thought of like, who's actually a good play. And then you can end up being like, okay, I'm going to underweight this guy, or I'm going to be way overweight this guy. And then the numbers come in totally differently on Sunday morning. So I think it's an interesting discussion, and obviously everybody handles it differently. But I think a lot of the field, like a lot of you guys listening to this, probably handle ownership closer to how I handle it, where it's not the core decision making structure for you. So maybe there's some things you guys can take from the way I handle it that will help you in how you can handle it sharply moving forward.
We will expand on this with the Zack Moss conversation, I'm sure, when we talk running backs. But let's just do a quick macro overview of this slate. I'm pretty excited about it. We got 4 games with totals over 47. This Denver Broncos Texans game. We got Lions and Saints. We got Niners and Eagles. And what's the other one I'm missing there? Oh, yeah, of course, Dolphins and Commanders. How are you feeling in general about week 13?
Well, I mean, I think the answer is obvious, right? You play Joe Flacco on 100% of your lineups. You know that he's the GOAT. Don't really do that. I think that this is one of those slates where, and I see it in early ownership projections that not enough people are asking this question, but where to me it's critical to ask who can separate from the field. And obviously that's important every week when we talk about playing for first place, not just putting good scores onto a roster, but playing for first place. But especially on a week like this, where there probably won't be a lot that separates from the field. And so that component of thinking through what can separate. So in terms of like, is there a game that can outproduce Miami and Washington and San Francisco and Philadelphia, right? You have to think about that if you go to other games. Not saying that they're not answering that question, but saying that's a question that you should ask. So yeah, I kind of see those two games at the top. I see Denver and Houston as an interesting spot, but I'm sure we'll talk about it a little bit. And I actually kind of tuned out, so I didn't hear the fourth game that you mentioned. What was the fourth game you mentioned?
The Lions Saints has a total of 47.
Okay. Yeah, that one to me, I look at it in terms of like, how are these teams going to try to win, right? So if you're the Lions, you already like to lean on the run, especially in the red zone. The Saints probably aren't going to have their top three wide receivers unless we, get a surprise Chris Olave appearance. And so if you're the Lions, you have to be looking at that game and saying, well, let's take control of this game and kind of maneuver our way to a win. It's not likely to turn into a true shootout when you have the Saints with no weapons, and the Lions being the type of team that is willing to kind of grind out a win when they take a lead. So that game is less exciting to me in terms of, could it go to 47 points? Yeah. Can it shoot out to like 60 combined points? The chances are pretty low. So that one's kind of lower on my list, but yeah, I like the other three spots for sure.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on that as well. I was reading Pat Thorman's Pace Up article. He obviously highlighted Dolphins Commanders, highlighted Texans Broncos. I was surprised to see Lions Saints as Pace Up too, just knowing that I think those teams would like to slow things down a bit. Shout out to everyone hanging out in the chat. I see some of my guys here drumming up likes. 179 watching and only 33 likes. And we got Wondercat here, 49 likes, 239 watching. So if you guys are watching, don't mind hitting that like button, subscribing. We do this show every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Although now is a good time to mention, we will have a slightly different schedule next week. I'm going to be heading to Miami with Underdog for their live final on Friday. So we're going to move this up. We're going to do a Thursday edition, maybe a little bit more of a first look type vibe. 5 p.m. Eastern, I believe, is when we lock that in, right, Jam?
Yep, 5 p.m. Eastern. I am flying home on Wednesday, and we're going to get our tree after you and I finish the show. That's a Christmas tree, not like a magnolia tree or anything for the front yard. We're going to get our Christmas tree on Thursday after the show. So yeah, we'll record from 2 to 3 my time Pacific, and then it'll be Christmas decorating time.
There we go. All right, let's head over now and start talking specifically about quarterbacks. You mentioned some of these guys we have at the high end. You got Jalen Hurts and Brock Purdy going against each other. You got Tua, and of course, Sam Howell is always willing to chuck it. You mentioned Houston Texans, CJ Stroud. He's up to 8,100, but obviously in a nice spot. How are you feeling about quarterback this week?
Yeah, to me, like for core builds, for tighter builds, it's those first four guys. It's the Purdy and Hurts. It's the Howell and Tua type of setup. Interestingly, for whatever it's worth, I mean, Howell does have more DraftKings points per game than Tua this year, right? I think that people just kind of misperceive those players and those situations. Obviously, Tua has the better matchup in this spot. Although, we look at the Lions or the Dolphins defense, and it's like, oh, well, they're pretty good against the pass. And it's like, well, look through their game logs, and it's like, yeah, they're pretty good against the pass. They played the Patriots twice. They played Tim Boyle. They played whoever else they played this year. So, yeah, I think that those four are kind of in the bucket of like, if I'm going to other places, I have to think, can they outscore these guys? Russ is very unprojectable, but that he can pop for that 30-point game. Kind of interesting too, because, like Purdy's projectable, Howell's projectable, but who you pair them with is unprojectable. I think that's a key discussion point on this slate as well, because one of the things that I want to be thinking about is if there aren't a lot of high-end scores, somebody is getting the right Washington piece, right? Like if Howell hits, somebody's getting the right Washington pieces, because it's usually a double stack that works when Howell hits. Somebody's getting the right Washington pieces. Somebody's getting the right 49ers piece in this game against Philadelphia. And so I think there can be this tendency, especially if you're playing one roster, 3 rosters, to be like, I'm going to leave the guesswork on those guys out and just kind of go in a different direction. But really the sharper way to go is to say, I'm still competing for first place, and somebody's going to get that right 49ers piece and that right Washington piece or right Washington pieces on a roster together. So I need to be taking shots and trying to get that if you think those games are going in a particular direction. So, and that kind of ends up like, I could be 100% Tyreek Hill this week, right? So that leaves me with 7 roster spots left. And then there's a price component that, if you take out defense, 7
Is
roster
that a Zack Moss comment? 7 roster spots left?
Not necessarily. No. I'm talking about defense, right? I take defense out of there.
Oh, okay, gotcha. I was like, reading
then there's
between
the
the lines
pricing
there.
component, right? To where you're kind of forced down to like a Zack Moss or a Greg Dortch or Elijah Moore, Jonathan Mingo, however you're going to handle that type of situation. Brevin Jordan, actually pretty interesting play this week if Dalton Schultz ends up missing. And so there's like a pricing component there. So you don't like the way I'm seeing roster builds this week, there's not a ton of flexibility in how it's like just a handful of spots in the middle. And those are going to be largely filled up with pieces from these games. So I'm not branching really far out of those 2 games just because of the nature of how rosters are going to come together for me. So yeah, that's kind of how I see. I don't even know which part of the discussion we were on there, but yeah, that's kind of how I see things on my end.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Denver because I've been pretty interested in them with a lot of my early underdog drafts this week. We're going to talk more about Battle Royale on Off and On the Clock immediately following this show over with the Badge Bros. But, one of the simple things that it's like, I was kind of down on the Jags last week. I just have been frustrated with their offense. And then it's like, well, the Texans push their opposition to playing fast, playing catch-up mode. We saw the Bucs have their biggest offensive explosion of the year against the Texans a month or so back. And I'm looking at this Denver team. They've won 5 straight. And it's like, I really want to be interested in them in this spot as kind of underdogs who might just be in garbage time mode there. Like, could Russell Wilson find his way into any of your builds?
Yeah, I think right now I'm kind of like they're on the borderline of the way that this usually ends up working for me is like this stack or this quarterback or these teams that are on the borderline of like single entry 3 max guys or like NME guys. What I end up doing is I'll end up having like 10, 12, 13 single entry 3 max rosters. And like 1 or 2 of those are going to end up being taken up with like a CJ Stroud and a Russell Wilson, just because I want to say, like even last week I had 3, I do like all 3 power sweeps and I'll do different rosters in each of them. So that middle size power sweep, I went with 3 Matthew Stafford rosters. That was the only place in 3 max single entry that I used Matthew Stafford. Pretty much everywhere else it was Josh Allen, but it was like Stafford was on that middle ground for me of like whether I wanted to use him in single entry 3 max or not. So it was like, okay, let me allocate some of these to him and then leave the rest of them to Josh Allen. So I could see myself doing that this week. It's a game where the Texans, I mean, there's a lot that goes into this, right? How are the Texans going to try to win? I think that if we really take our NFL knowledge, we could actually play this game a lot sharper than the field and recognize 2 things. One, the Broncos have allowed the fifth fewest passing yards to wide receivers this year. So how do the Texans move the ball? Well, they've allowed the most yards to running backs on the ground this year and like the 7th most yards to tight ends this year. You heard me mention Brevin Jordan earlier. Obviously, if Dalton Schultz plays, he's very interesting there. But another key point there, who played 80% of the snaps for the Texans last week? Devin Singletary. And people are just looking at like, oh, he and Dameon Pierce had similar touch totals. Devin Singletary played over 80% of the snaps. I mean, that's wild. And he's coming in currently like sub 3% owned, 5,900. So I do think that there's interesting ways to play that game to where you could say, it could be kind of high scoring, but maybe not exactly in the way that people think, and you look at the Broncos, Cortland Sutton has 2 games of 11 targets on the year. Those are the only games all year from Broncos pass catcher of more than 7 targets. So every single game, what are we, 11 games into the season for them? Or they might not even have had a bye yet. But anyhow, all these games for the Broncos, right? There's only been 2 instances of somebody going over 7 targets. So I do think that it's hard to find that high-end score from the Broncos pass catchers. I do think it's interesting that Jmtowin Williams has a very similar touch projection to Zack Moss, very similar matchup to Zack Moss, very similar team scoring expectation to Zack Moss. And he's 1,100 more, but once the games start, once we flip the cards over, price no longer matters. What matters is what you're scoring from your team. And so 1,100 is not that much. I do think there's a component to saying Jmtowin Williams, who's not going to be overlooked, but he's going to be, maybe 40% the ownership of Zack Moss, could easily outscore Zack Moss. And so I think he's an interesting play. And I do think that like the pass catchers, or I should say the wide receivers on both sides, I'm not going to play them as one-offs myself this week. I'm going to play them like in stacks and then leave them off otherwise. And like last week I had, I think it was 35% Nico Collins and 45% Tank Dell, and just mixed and matched them across all my rosters, knowing one of them was probably going to hit and the other one probably wouldn't kill me. This week, it's not going to be my approach with this offense. So that game is kind of like on that fringe for me. And I understand how, same thing we talked about with the Bills last week. Like when you're playing a team that's going to score points and be aggressive, you have to score points and be aggressive. So in this game even with Washington and Miami, like Miami's going to know that Washington is going to pass the ball and pass the ball and pass the ball. So it compels Miami to be more aggressive. San Francisco and Philadelphia, two of the most aggressive-minded teams in the NFL. They face the top two opponent pass rate over expectations in the NFL. So it just sets up this type of game environment where even if it doesn't take off early, the mindset for each team is like, we've got to be aggressive, we've got to score points. And so it just creates that opportunity for like a 60-plus point combined score where you don't really have that opportunity as many avenues to that type of score in Denver and Houston, which is kind of how I'm seeing it.
How do you, not to like belabor the Russ thing, but also kind of in conjunction with the talking point from, was that 2 weeks ago that a naked Brock Purdy team won the Millionaire Maker? And there's a lot of conversation around that. How do you think about that? If you really like a spot for the quarterback, but whether because of pricing or whether because there's not a lot of viable stacking options, how do you approach those situations? Or do you always want to be like, look, one of these pass catchers is getting there if he's optimal, and I'm going to try to at least take cracks at that?
I'm probably more willing than most to go without a stacking partner. I think there's kind of two interesting examples this week, right? Like, I think some people could be tempted to do it with Sam Howell because it's so difficult to predict who will hit with him.
Right.
But somebody typically hits with him, right? So if you get Howell naked and somebody else has Howell with the right stacking partner, they're ahead of you. Russ, on the other hand, he can hit without anyone being like a tournament winner on his roster. So you could probably justify that a little bit more. Even with that, like, somebody's going to score 20 points. The interesting thing with Purdy is like, he's 6K and all his pass catchers, if Debo doesn't hit, well, then all his other guys are like, if Ayuk hits and Ayuk has, I think it's like 3 games all year north of 6 targets, so it's like, if he hits, it's still going to be in like this 27, 28 point range. It's not like tournament winning. If CMC hits for 25 to 27, he still costs 9K. So like, that one is probably the closest you can get on like a non-rushing quarterback to where it can make sense, just because of the way that the pricing sets up. With Russ, you can kind of justify it because you might only get 20 points from the guy who hits, and that's not really like something you had to have. And there's a lot of guesswork then that goes into trying to get it. And then on the Howell one, it would be like, definitely stack him with people is how I would see those 3 spots. So yeah, Russ falls into sort of a gray area where you could definitely justify it and you could see that winning a tournament.
Any other guys that we should mention at the low end? I feel like everyone kind of knows what they're getting out of Jalen Hurts at this point, but maybe like the Baker Mayfields, the Kenny Pickett's, the Gardner Minshews, anything down there?
Yeah, I mean, I won't argue against anybody going to those. To me, again, that question has to be, can they outscore all of Russ, Purdy, and Howell? And my answer, I'm not saying that like this is the definitive answer if we played out the slate 100 times, but just like the answer that I'm going to bet on this week is going to be no. So the answer I'm going to bet on this week is, and I actually have a pretty broad running back pool. So it's kind of a interesting way I'm playing things with like a tight quarterback pool, tight range of pass catchers, and then a broad range of running backs. And I think that will differentiate me because a lot of people I'll have a lot of Zack Moss, but a lot of people will be so heavy on Zack Moss that there won't be that mix and match of different ways to play the running back position. And there are about 7, 8, 9 guys who could all go for 20 to 30 points. And so if Zack Moss has like the 12-point game, 14-point game, or even if it's Zack Moss with like Devin Singletary, that people don't have that same second guy, kind of gives me a way to mix and match that. But yeah, I'm going to be playing a very tight range of quarterbacks. And my bet this week, I mean, it's Friday afternoon, right? But as of right now, my bet this week, I expect it to be these other cheap guys don't outscore all 3 of these guys from these 3 more attractive games.
Gotcha. Let's use that to pivot into talking about running backs. Before we do, real quick, got to mention we got a new promo code. Every single week, we're rolling out a new promo code here. We're up to Pete 70. Eventually, you guys are is it just going to be free by week 17?
Pete 100.
Yeah, Pete 100, 100% off. But we are up to 70% off. It is a new code, Pete 70. The original code Pete will still get you the discounts on some of the other packages if you want to check it out. But if you want the OWS, DFS, Inner Circle stuff, you can get 70% off with code Pete70 over there at 1 week season. But let's talk about running back, Jam. I think all conversations this week at running back have to start with Zack Moss. Obviously too cheap for his role, projects extremely well, probably going to be the highest owned player we've seen on a slate all year. Where would you like to kick off the Zack Moss discourse as you throw on something?
I'll put a pillow behind me. I've got this.
Okay.
I got this chair that like leans back, but then the mic's up here, so I'm kind of this is a little bit better. Yeah. So, I think the interesting thing is just how attached to pricing people can get, because again, raw points is what's really going to matter, especially in a range of 1,200 to 1,500. Like if you're looking at like a 7K wide receiver, but like Stephon Diggs and pre 2023 Cooper Kupp and Justin Jefferson, like these guys are all like 1,500 more, 1,800 more. You're gonna be like, let me just move the salary to get to these guys, right? Now Zack Moss should be priced around these other guys, but my point is just that like that's not that much in salary, and I think that the ownership is going to overstate his likelihood of hitting. Tennessee's the number 2 DVOA run defense. They've gotten back to where they were heading into the season. So still a really tough match, right? I was in my DFS interpretations for that game. I was writing up like, the Tennessee ranks here, and I was going to put like like all these running backs have still had good games against him. And it was like, but Zack Moss went for 165 yards against him, and Jaylen Warren went for 88 on 11 carries. And it was like, that's it, So it's like, it's not like this is just a smash spot where just because he's getting 18 to 22 touches, he's going to hit. So I like, Zack Moss. It's less about Zack Moss and more about his fit in this really creative, aggressive run scheme that Shane Steichen has drawn up. But there are these plays, and we said it earlier in the year when Jonathan Taylor was rounding into form, where it was like, there are these plays where Zack Moss gets 15 yards, and it's like, that would be 80 yards for Jonathan Taylor. So, Zack Moss isn't that guy, so to speak. I really like Zack Moss. I still think I'll have, just because of the nature of salary this week and how much Tyreek Hill I want to get, I'll still probably have, 30, 35% Zack Moss, but I'll actually probably end up being underweight the field on him because there are a lot of other interesting guys, that aren't that much more expensive than him. And I can see the pathway to Moss having 25, and I'll have the rosters then that have Moss, but I can also see the pathway to him having 12 or 15 points, and multiple other guys scoring 22 to 25. And so I want to have that open avenue to mixing and matching the right pairings at running back.
Interesting, like game theory thought I just had. If you don't play Zack Moss, do you think it'd be sharp to play 3 running backs, or because essentially in the flex where you're saying, not only am I getting access to an extra running back that the field isn't getting to with Moss, but I'm going to get in a third. And if it is a week where multiple other running backs go off, I'm just thinking that through of like how you could even further leverage not playing Zack Moss.
Yeah, I think that's really sharp. Actually, just this morning I switched my settings in the Bink Machine Opto over to 40% running back in the flex. I don't know if it'll stay there, but that willingness to have up to 40%. And this year, like the most running back in the flex I've had is 10 to 15%. Just because it's a week where I'm going to go through some of these guys priced around these running backs. Adam Thielen, obviously we're all down on him after last week. Can he go for another 30-point game? Yes, but also, he might get 12 to 15 or less. If Deebo Samuel isn't the 49ers who hits, like you've got Garrett Wilson still attached to Tim Boyle. You've got DeAndre Hopkins, who rarely sees more than 4 targets. You've got Amari Cooper, on the outside with Joe Flacco trying to get him the ball. You've got Terry McLaurin, who's hardly cracked 15 points this year. Cortland Sutton, who's really unpredictable. So it's like, I do think that there's viability to saying, hey, like there could be 3, 4, 5 running backs in this price range who outscore all the wide receivers in this price range. And so already I think that running back in the flex is more viable than normal this week.
Right.
And then, I think that next step, that strategy step of saying, okay, I'm going to have like no running back in the flex and then running back in the flex and bet on Zack Moss having a disappointing game, then you really can like separate even further from the people who have 2 running backs with Zack Moss as one of them. So definitely a sharp way to play things.
Yeah, we can kind of now move down the line some other guys who are really projecting as good values. Rachaad White gets this really nice matchup against the Panthers, who continue to give up big games to running backs. He's at 6,300. You mentioned Javonte, 5,700. Other values I'm seeing, Jaylen Warren, potentially Ramondre Stevenson. What else is catching your eye at running back this week?
Yeah, you're hitting on most of them. I mentioned Devin Singletary. Rachaad White is an interesting setup because he's not great on the ground. Like most of his value comes through the air. The Panthers are actually really good against running backs through the air. So it's kind of like you are betting on the touchdowns for Rachaad White. And if you don't get them, you kind of end up with that 13 to 15 point score, but still really like that play. I think it's going to be overrated in terms of how people will approach it, but still a really sharp play. Ramondre, last week when Bailey Zappi came in, that first drive, I think they called like 5 screen passes on that first drive with Bailey Zappi. Both of Zappi's starts, small sample size of both of his starts last year, Ramondre was heavily emphasized. One of them, he had 25 carries and like 165 rushing yards. Another one, he had 2 rushing touchdowns. So kind of take some stuff off of Bailey Zappi's plate and give the ball to Ramondre a little bit more. I think that's definitely something I'm going to be leaning into this week. And then those Steelers running backs, they're both going to get, last week, Kenny Pickett threw 33 passes. That was his most pass attempts since week 1. And still the running backs combined for 28 carries between the two of them. So, and 31 total touches, I think it was. So, you're not getting the 18 to 22 touches that you're going to get from Zack Moss, but you're still probably getting 15 to 16 touches. Jaylen Warren can score from anywhere on the field. So I think he's very interesting against Arizona. And Najee Harris, they're going to keep throwing us these curve balls where Najee Harris is going to keep getting all these touches and, maybe he scores the touchdown. So yeah, I think those guys are interesting. I'll do the same thing I did last week, which is put a little bit of double Pittsburgh running back builds onto my roster. So maybe I think last week, 6% of my rosters had that, but I had a lot of Steelers running backs last week. So this week it might be 3 or 4% of my rosters might go double Steelers running backs. And then, have both those guys mixing into my tighter build. So I think running back's interesting. And then you get up above that price range. I think the main guy I like is Derrick Henry, just in terms of what he can do. And I think his ownership will be low this week. Obviously, Raheem Mostert, very interesting. And then you get up to Christian McCaffrey. Bad matchup. Philadelphia, last week was the first week they gave up running back rushing touchdown, but Christian McCaffrey kind of take the matchup off the table a little bit. So if he's projecting 25% owned, if he ends up in that range, I'll be underweight Christian McCaffrey, but I'll still have, probably 15% CMC, something like that.
Let me ask you about Raheem Mostert. I think that's an interesting one. We all like this game environment. Seems like people are in general flocking to the passing game. The other wrinkle we have is earlier today, Mike McDaniel saying Devon Achane will play. So we're going to get both of those backs going. How are you thinking about that as it pertains to Mostert and then Achane, in a vacuum as a play?
So right now, this is this morning thought, but right now I'm kind of thinking Achane, he missed those games, came back, re-aggravated the injury, missed another game. He's probably not coming back to a 50% snap share. So I would kind of guess that he comes back to this, and Savon Ahmed's out. Jeff Wilson is, was getting touches, but kind of as their last resort of guys they wanted to give the ball to. So I could see in this spot, Mostert getting 60 to 65%. Achane getting 30, 35%, or maybe 25%, and Wilson mixes in a little bit. So I'm going to treat Mostert as of right now. I'm going to treat him as the lead back and the guy who's going to get the touches and the guy likeliest to hit. Obviously, large field play, mix in a little bit of Achane as well, just because he can score from anywhere on the field on 8 or 9 touches, put up a big game. But Mostert's kind of the guy I'm leaning toward at the moment.
Let me ask you about the guy who broke the slate last week, returns from IR. Kyren Williams drops 40 plus points, has an unbelievable workload. Now a tougher matchup here versus Cleveland, 7,200. I was legitimately surprised that he wasn't projecting better here. Doesn't seem like he's going to be super popular either. You didn't mention him, so I'm guessing you're not that interested in him either.
Yeah, he's not on my list, but when I get to Saturday night is when I really start saying who is just under owned and needs to go on my list because of that. And so Kyren Williams is the type of guy who's going to end up on some percentage of my MME builds, but he's not going to be on my tighter builds. We've talked about a lot of running backs, right? And so it could sound like this is my MME pool. This is my single entry 3 max pool right now. Right. It's 8, 9 different guys that I'll mix and match. Cause again, I'm really tight at quarterback, really tight at pass catchers. I would expect to have Kyren Williams. It's one of those spots where the Browns defense has this reputation and they are really good and they don't give up a lot of yards. And yet you look at they keep giving up 20 plus points, right? I mean, it's obviously part of it is their offense keeps turning the ball over, but their run defense isn't as scary as their pass defense. So there's certainly opportunity for Kyren Williams to have a big game, matchup and game environment setup. He probably doesn't, but I want to account for the possibility that he could with this large workload. And he is a really talented back from what we've seen so far this season.
Let me ask you about 2 other sets of running back pairs, because I think there's some similarities between them. In the high end, you got Kamara and Eckler, 2 kind of backs who've been struggling with efficiency, still have awesome pass catching workloads. Don't think either of them are going to be very popular. Any interest on the formerly great fantasy running backs?
Austin Eckler is 13 mile an hour top speed. No on Eckler. I mean, I just think Eckler is fundamentally overpriced at this point, right? And if even his pass catching role isn't as big as we perceive it to be, right? I mean, 6 targets last week, 3, 7, 7, 8. Okay, those are pretty good, but 2, 6, 5. It's not like he's seeing 10, 12 targets like we would expect with Mike Williams out, Josh Palmer out. He's still kind of in that 5 to 8 target range. So no on Eckler. I do think Kamara is interesting. I just kind of took him off of my tighter builds list this morning, which means he could sneak back onto my MME play. Just not a great matchup against Detroit. But I do want to think about, if you are the Saints, you're going to emphasize your top weapons. And that's probably not A.T. Perry and Lynn Bowden and Keith Kirkwood, right? Not to say that you can't play those guys, but just to say, like, you're not going in and saying, okay, how do we scheme up a bunch of targets for our 4th, 5th, and 6th wide receivers? It's going to be, Jawan Johnson played half of his snaps from the slot this year, so he's going to be involved. I think that this is a Taysom Hill type of game where they're going to try to get him 10 plus touches, and then probably Kamara will be heavily involved in the passing attack. I just don't know what the ceiling is against that Detroit defense, and with this Saints offense missing so many weapons, already pretty bad in the red zone, missing so many weapons. But I'm not like totally putting Kamara out of mind.
And then one last pair. I don't love like the matchup or game environment for either, but I still do like Breece Hall and Bijan Robinson's talent. They're both priced similarly. Any love for those guys this week?
Yeah, I mean, Breece Hall, a guy I cut off my tighter list this morning. Bijan, I cut him off yesterday. So it's not like I'm down on these guys. I probably won't have them on tighter builds, but I wouldn't argue against them on tighter builds either.
Makes sense. We're going to transition to wide receiver here. Appreciate all you guys in the chat. Guys like Sammy here and Matt, who are YouTube members. If you guys are YouTube members, get you access to a few different things here. You get 2 extra premium shows a week that are available only for YouTube members. I do a DFS After Dark interview series on Saturday nights. This week I am having on Sacrilegious. He does stat chasing for us. Uber sharp DFS and best ball player. Is also going to be doing some work for Pat Carane's site, Legendary Upside, with playoff best ball. Qualified for the Dog Bowl as well. So going to pick his brain about what he's been up to. And then Sunday morning, we'll have the cram, the week 13 cram. We'll go over overnight news, all the latest thoughts, do a pick'em entry, all of that good stuff. And then you also unlock the Hand Builder and Optobros channel within the Deposit Kingdom Discord. We talk about showdown slates in there. I share information, leverage plays from Run the Sims, all of that good stuff. So hop in there, take advantage of that. Good bang for your buck as a YouTube member. And JM, let's transition now to wide receiver. And let's, of course, start right at the top with the cover boy, Tyreek Hill, in a smash spot. You already hinted lock button play for you this week.
Yeah, I mean, potentially. And the way I want to look at it is he guaranteed? This is how I try to process these types of things. So, and this is kind of what I was laying out for Scott last night, and just how I'm seeing the Zack Moss and Tyreek Hill situations is, like, Zack Moss, he has this sort of wide range of outcomes, and, he can miss. And so I don't want to just like say, oh man, all the Zack Moss on my end, right? And Tyreek Hill, there's a component of he can miss. But we've seen this year, he has 8 of his 11 games have been 25.8 or more DraftKings points, I think is the number. The 3 times that he's missed has been healthy early season New England, healthy early season Buffalo, and then that great defense of Kansas City. So it's been pretty predictable where he misses. Could he miss? We play at the slate 100 times. Could he miss? Absolutely, right? Crazy things happen, but I'm willing to sort of take on that risk as, a former single entry player and say he probably doesn't miss this week. Now, could he score 25.8 points, or could he score 27 points and you really didn't need to pay that salary for him? Yes. But what's really cool about this week is with Zack Moss, Greg Dortch, some of these other salary, savings that are available, Brevin Jordan, you can build a really sharp roster and put AJ Brown or Christian McCaffrey onto that Tyreek Hill build, which also means that, if you like Devontae Smith or one of these other guys in the 7K price range, or Brandon Ayuk, however you want to play it, you can kind of have that flexibility to say, who is the guy who could outscore Tyreek Hill? So it's not like going 100% Tyreek Hill boxes me out of having the guys who could outscore him. So because Tyreek Hill is sort of like, if he misses, it's like I always say, any 30-point score is valuable, regardless of what you paid for it. So if he misses, it's still in that 30-point range almost all the time, and he could put up one of these 40, 45-point games. So to me, he's one of those guys who I just want to say, let me get him in and sort of take this range of 27 to 40 plus points. And then if he misses, that's the low end is still that pretty good score. And I can still have some rosters that have like the guy who could end up passing him, right? So it doesn't exclude me from having the guy who it's like, oh, everybody else is like, oh man, why did I play Tyreek Hill? I should have had AJ Brown. He scored 38 and Tyreek Hill scored 27. It's like, I can still get those guys together. So Tyreek Hill he's that guy. And I also think the Dolphins, there's a component here of Mike McDaniel, and just from a personality standpoint, he does seem like the kind of guy who's like, oh, I'd love to get Tyreek Hill this 2,000 yards record. Kyle Shanahan's very much that way as well with his players, where if there's a record on the table, he wants to get that record for them. So this seems like a spot where they're obviously, if they're up by a ton, they take him off the field because they want to keep him healthy. But you're playing this Washington team that's so aggressive, throws the ball so much that, this game could stay close enough for Tyreek Hill to play the whole thing. And I think if they keep emphasizing him throughout.
Let's say, hypothetically, if you did have 100% Tyreek Hill, what percentage of those would be paired with Tua, and how many of those would be as a one-off?
They would be like mutually exclusive thought processes for me. So it would be how much Tua do I want, not how much Tua do I want because I have all this Tyreek Hill. I mean, we've seen Tua's been valuable twice this year, right? He has a couple games of just over 30 points. And Tyreek Hill has been valuable 8 times this year. So it's not like Tyreek hits, and that means that you had to have Tua in that spot, even at his price tag. Tyreek Hill's 47-point game, I think, was a 31-pointer for Tua. So at his price tag, it's like you could get 26 points from Purdy or 27 points from Howell, and you're not really that far behind because you save that salary. So totally mutually exclusive thoughts for me.
What you mentioned, like with the Texans wide receivers, really only having interest in them within that game environment and not playing them as one-offs. I'll flip it then and say, what wide receivers this week are you interested in as one-offs, where you don't like the game environment, but you like that play?
Well, there's a component of how do I fit in Tyreek Hill on all these rosters. And so to that end, Greg Dortch is obviously one of the guys. Michael Wilson's already been announced as out. Let me see. I just pulled up this number on Greg Dortch, and I'll go ahead and on my computer where nothing is as it should be. But yeah, Greg Dortch is like, when you look at what he has done when he has gotten work, it just makes so much sense. So, okay, here I pulled this up. Said he's underpriced. Across his last 8 games where he's seen significant snaps, he's averaging 16.2 DraftKings points per game. He has 7 double-digit scores in those 8 games. He has 4 games north of 15 points. So half his games have been north of 15 points, 2 games north of 20. Comparing that to Josh Downs, who, you could say Dortch should be priced around that. Josh Downs is averaging 11.5 across his last 8 games, 4 games of double digits compared to 7 for Dortch, 2 games north of 15 compared to 4 for Dortch, 1 game north of 20 compared to 2 for Dortch. So just in terms of like what you're getting at that 3,700 price tag, he just stands out so much because when he's on the field, he commands targets. So he kind of becomes one of these pieces. Elijah Moore, if we want to say Flacco, throws it kind of with a little bit more accuracy to his wide receivers, but maybe can't push the ball outside the numbers. Interestingly, he threw the ball to Elijah Moore last year with the Jets. They didn't ever really have a good connection, but Elijah Moore, Jonathan Mingo, some of these cheaper guys that can help me free up the salary for the Tyreek Hill. And then, I'm going to have the game stacks built around Philadelphia, San Francisco, and probably pull some of those pieces as one-offs too. So like on my Howell and Tua rosters, have some Debo, have some Ayuk, have some Devontae Smith, have some AJ Brown. And that just really doesn't leave a lot of additional space for remaining wide receivers, beyond that, because it's about how do I fit in this build that I want to put together this week.
We talked a little bit about the Commanders wide receivers. It does look like Terry McLaurin's going to be fairly popular at 5,500. I've been more in the camp of not paying up for that and just playing Curtis Samuel and Logan Thomas when I'm trying to get exposure there. But how will you be thinking about, bringbacks or Commanders stuff around your big Tyreek Hill exposure?
I mean, like I said, if Howell's hitting, probably 2 of these guys are hitting. Even if Howell's not hitting, one of these guys at their price tags, one of these guys is probably putting up a solid score. So I'm going to have a lot of these guys mixed and matched in. I'm looking forward to listening to this morning's Searching for Ceiling podcast with Lord Reeves and Hilo on OWS. You can find that on OWS podcast feed or YouTube channel, but they always sort of have some takes and thoughts on like how the matchups tilt towards specific players that I might not be seeing myself. So I'm hoping that they can elucidate something for me with regards to this Washington set of pass catchers and maybe who's likeliest to hit. But, it is interesting. I kind of calculated some pairings like Dotson plus Samuel in their last 8 games. They have games. So they're 8.7K in salary. So you could think of them as an 8.7K wide receiver. They have a game of 32.2 combined points, a game of 34 combined points, a game of 30.9 combined points, a game of 24.5 combined points. So half of their games, they've combined for 24 plus points as this quote 8.7K wide receiver. 3 of their 8 games, 30 plus points. And then this one like total bomb of 2.6 points. And then the other ones have been kind of this 12 to 15 point range. So pairings like that, there's actually several ways that you can put those together where it's like, you might not be able to isolate which individual guy, but kind of play them as a block of 8K in salary, 7.7K in salary. Samuel plus Logan Thomas also has some interesting, numbers that have aligned, Dotson and Logan Thomas. And then I also want to account for the fact that like McLaurin hasn't hit yet, but the usage is there for him to hit. The talent is there for him to hit. So like I ended up like really liked Rashee Rice last week and then ended up being like, you know what though, he's 5,500 and he hasn't hit yet, and went with no Rashee Rice. But McLaurin's kind of the same camp where it's like the usage has been there for him to hit. It just hasn't happened yet. So I do still want to account for the fact that he can hit as well. Probably be underweight the field, given where the field is pegging him, and be overweight on Dotson and Samuel, the guys that the field isn't as high on. But to me, it's like I don't have answers on those guys right now. So right now it's kind of just mix and match them and hope I land on the right ones on the right rosters.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any other kind of maybe one-off wide receivers and other game environments that we're not as excited about? I'll throw out some names here. You got your Michael Pittmans, you got your Keenan Allens, maybe the Steelers wide receivers. Anything jump out to you there? Mike Evans is always putting up big scores, it seems.
Yeah, I like the Steelers as kind of like a fringe. It'd be great if Deontay Johnson were out or George Pickens were out, because when we would know like one of these guys, like the other guy is going to hit. I think they're interesting. I think their chance of hitting are pretty low, but they're on my like fringe one-off list. The Browns are on my fringe one-off list. I mean, Amari Cooper is so good and does so much with just moderately good quarterback play. I don't think Flacco is bringing that to the table, but I do think that he's going to be super low owned, and the upside is a lot higher than people give him credit for. Josh Downs over Michael Pittman for me. I mean, Michael Pittman, he's not going to bury me for not playing him. He has 2 games of 30 points in his career. If he goes for his first like 37 pointer this week at high ownership when I'm not playing him, great for him, great for everybody who played him. But most of the time he's going to score, in this 15 to 22 point range, which at his price tag kind of hurts the people who played him. So no Pittman for me, but I will have a little bit of Downs. And then just because I have so little interest in like one-offs in other places, DeAndre Hopkins is currently on my list just as a guy who could hit for a big game. And I don't want to overlook the possibility of that, but no, pretty narrow list for me outside of the core stuff I'm looking at.
Okay. Any other wide receivers we haven't hit on here? We might even be able to sneak in a little tight end talk by itself before we build.
Let's sneak in a little tight end talk.
Yeah, we normally let this just overflow into the lineup build here, but let's give it some of its proper attention. I mean, you really do have kind of like the 3 big guys at the top is from a projection standpoint. You got Kittle, McBride, Laporta. You got a little bit of the mid-range here. Njoku coming off a big target game. Pat Freiermuth coming off of a big game. And then, a real choose your own adventure beyond that. Is anyone really jumping out for you at tight end?
No, nobody. And Kittle, it's the ceiling's there, but the lack of certainty is obviously like that stands out as well. Logan Thomas, the ceiling is there for the price, but same thing, lack of certainty in terms of, whether he'll have just a bomb of a game or a really good game. McBride, I don't love the matchup for him against Pittsburgh, Minkah Fitzpatrick on the field. But he can certainly hit. So I'm not as high on him as probably the field will be this week. I mentioned, I do think just in terms of getting in the minds of the coaches, how are the Saints going to try to win this game? They'll probably emphasize Taysom Hill. So I do think he's a very interesting play. And then I mentioned if Dalton Schultz is out, Brevin Jordan in this matchup against the Broncos, it really filter targets to tight ends. I think that at 2,500, he's an interesting way to go. But I mean, nothing like, last week we had Pat Freiermuth that just really leaped off the screen at 2,900. Nothing like that this week. So yeah, I mean, Juwan Johnson, David Njoku, all viable plays, but nothing really that is compelling me to feel excited about playing any individual piece.
Let me just follow up real quick about Freiermuth, just because he smashed last week. We saw in week 11, 39% of the routes. Last week jumps to 62% of the routes. So still not even running like a full complement, but of course gets those 35% of the targets. Like, what did you see from this new look sans Matt Canada offense? Like, do you think funneling targets to the tight end position, was that just a blip or a randomness factor? Or do you think that's going to be a staple of the offense going forward?
Well, we always want to think about, so there's a quote from Joe Burrow last year where he said, I throw the ball where the defense tells me to throw the ball. That's by and large what a lot of these guys are going to do. And the Bengals tell opponents to throw the ball to the tight end. So that's a big part of it right there. Obviously, the play calling was the very first play of the game that they took a shot down the middle, like up the seam to Pat Freiermuth. That's not typical Steelers, Matt Canada football to throw the ball like over the middle of the field ever, let alone downfield on the first play of the game. So they were clearly making a statement with that first play of like, hey, we're going to be a little bit more aggressive. They threw the ball 33 times, but they're still going to be a more conservative offense than most offenses. So this is a week where Arizona really kind of fundamentally, structurally, they're not a good defense against tight ends, but they're so bad against wide receivers that tight ends don't rack up many stats against them. So that's kind of why Pat Freiermuth doesn't stand out to me as much this week. It's kind of why Brevin Jordan does stand out to me, because a defense that tells you, hey, you got to throw the ball to the tight end, those guys tend to see those 6, 7, 8 targets. And, then everybody jumps on them the next week and, they end up seeing 3 or 4 targets the next week. And everyone's like, oh man, like, why did that happen? It's like, well, because the defense didn't tell the quarterback to throw the ball to this guy. But yeah, it's nothing that I don't see the Steelers just saying, hey, we're going to emphasize the tight end a lot more. It was more a function of that matchup. And the matchup was a big part of the reason why I was on that play last week.
All right, we're going to do one more tight end because the chat has Juwan Johnson fever and it cannot be contained. I did just take a quick look at ownership projection. Seems like he is pacing to be one of the most popular tight ends on the slate, 3,400. I assume this is largely due to how banged up the Saints receiving core is. Any love for Juwan Johnson in this spot?
Yeah, I like Juwan Johnson. I played him too much last year. He's actually his wife or fiance, or I don't know what she is my wife's like one of her favorite social media follows. Apparently she
you mentioned that. Yeah.
Juwan Johnson are real funny on the social medias. But no, I like Juwan Johnson, a dude who stays to help the equipment crew clean up the locker room after the games, home games. So shout out to Juwan Johnson for that. Like I said, he's played almost 50%. It's like 150 out of 308 snaps have come in the slot. So, he is a kind of their fourth wide receiver, right? And you could say A.T. Perry is number 5 and Keith Kirkwood is number 6 and Lynn Bowden is number 7. So, no, I think that he's a sharp play this week. He had a lot of targets last week with the injuries piling up. So definitely on board with that play. He doesn't, again, like what are his chances of going for 20? Pretty low. What are his chances of going for 15? Even probably pretty low, but he could put up that 9 to 12 point game. And if he scores a touchdown, you're in great shape at his price tag.
All right. It's time. You guys know what we do now, and we head over to DraftKings and build a lineup with some of JM's favorite building blocks. Let's head over there. All right. As always, we do got the DraftKings rake-free league for the Deposit Kingdom community. Thank you to DraftKings for keeping this going. We got the very nice, very chill, danky dank 420 entries this week. We're at 348 right now. If you want to join this contest, the link is exclusively posted in the Deposit Kingdom Discord. I got that link down below. You go to the announcement section, you'll find the link. This will fill probably by Saturday by this rate. So hop in, lock in your spot, and then I'll review the winning lineups on my Monday morning portfolio review show. Do that every Monday, 10 a.m. We go through my GPP teams, my underdog teams, pick 'em entries, review the best ball portfolio, everything under the fantasy sun. So hop in the Discord and join us in this contest. But JM, blank canvas here, $50,000 salary. Where do you want to start?
Let's start with Tyreek Hill. Okay, let's start there.
Yeah.
There's 2 different building blocks that we could go with that kind of point toward this Tyreek Hill. So let's go ahead and go with Command Center 1, which we're going to throw in Sam Howell and Curtis Samuel and Jahan Dotson onto this roster. So as I mentioned, Curtis Samuel, Jahan Dotson, this 8,700 block of wide receiver salary. These last 4 of their last 8 games, they've scored 24 plus points together. 3 of them, they've scored 30 plus points. And so right now, just kind of taking that swing and saying, hey, somebody's going to hit with Sam Howell. And these would be the guys to do it, which Sam Howell, again, just shout out to this dude who's made us a ton of money this year. More fantasy points per game than everyone on this slate except Justin Herbert, or every quarterback on the slate except Justin Herbert, CJ Stroud, and Jalen Hurts. So Sam Howell should not be priced at 6,200. By the way, Pete, did you catch Sam Howell over under 221.5 passing yards on Underdog earlier this week?
Was that? Oh my goodness.
It was on Monday, and they had Tyreek Hill at 92.5, And
you know what? I actually think I did, because I blindly let me just do this now. I do want to show this because it's so funny you say that, because I was, seeing what did they put up, and I was not looking at projections. And I went and I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to build 2 right off the rip here. I did a McLaurin, Tyreek Hill, Tua, and then I did get the Sam Howell. So I got it at 282 combined pass rush. So I did not get the juicy one.
Yeah, it started out at 221 and a half passing yards, and now it's up to like 264 and a half. So that was a fun one. Definitely maxed out that one. But yeah, so we're going to go Sam Howell. Again, I've talked a lot about Sam Howell. He's not like the central piece for me this week. It's going to be Howell, Purdy, Hurts, and Tua. But I mean, Howell's just a fun guy to talk about. Opens up the salary. And let's go ahead and let's do one of these 3 running back builds. So I'm going to ask you, do you want to go with, so this is going to take Greg Dortch off this roster, which is totally fine. I'm not going 100% Greg Dortch, but we'll obviously have plenty of him. Do we want to go 3 running backs with Zack Moss, or try to do 3 running backs without Zack Moss?
I feel like the 3 running backs without Zack Moss is fun, just because everyone is going to know what Zack Moss looks like in their lineups. And I just kind of like that idea of, hey, if we're going to get in 3 running backs, that is going to be more than 2 running backs that the majority of the field is going to have access to, just combinatorially. So why don't we mess around with that?
Yeah, we might need Brevin Jordan on this roster just to make the salary work. Obviously, Juwan Johnson, 900 more. So we'll leave Singletary off for now. Let's go ahead and throw, let's leave the Steelers running backs as an option. Let's go ahead and throw Ramondre Stevenson on here. Let's go ahead and pick between, for now, Javonte Williams and Rachaad White, who I don't really have like I said, Javonte Williams, not a great matchup. Not a great matchup for Zack Moss, though, either. So if we're willing to bet on like not a great matchup and just bet on the talent and workload, Javonte Williams also is a guy we can consider. Or we could say Rachaad White scores the touchdowns against Carolina here.
You're giving me leash to go, be my crazy galaxy brain GPP bro. And so my next thought here with all these Zack Moss combinatronics is that he'll be paired with Rachaad White a good amount of the time, just because he projects well. And I kind of like what you're saying too, that people are going to overvalue that matchup based on what they've done for runners, which hasn't been Rachaad White's skill set. So let's keep leaning into getting off what the field's going to do here and do Javonte and Ramondre.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And last running back spot, then, if we're going to take these guys off, what I probably want to do is go with one of the Steelers running backs. Go with, and let's go with the Jaylen Warren one, because we have seen like he's still going to get those 14 to 16 touches. This is a game they should control, and he can obviously put up a big score on that workload in this matchup. And that ends up leaving us with actually quite a bit. A ton of flexibility. So we could even change what we're doing at another spot, given how much salary we have here. Defense this week, it seems like a week to just say, who are the worst quarterbacks and pick on those.
There's a lot to choose from.
So you got the Desmond Ridder, you got the Tim Boyle, you've got the Bryce Young, Frank Reich, rest in peace. Frank Reich, by the way, you listen to Nick Sirianni press conferences and he just like praises Frank Reich all the time. Yeah, he coached under him with that Colts team.
Yeah.
And like all the time talks about how much he learned from Frank Reich and what a tremendous coach he is. It's a shame that he kind of lost the buy-in from his players last year and then just had this awful situation in Carolina this year. But Frank Reich, good dude, apparently no longer a good NFL head coach, but love the guy. I remember watching that playoff comeback against the Houston Oilers back in the day. So Frank Reich, I don't know. Did you ever see that one? They were down 35-3 at halftime and they came back and won that game.
That's wild.
Backup quarterback Frank Reich, divisional round of the playoffs. Okay. That was memory lane. Yeah, let's pick one of these defenses. I actually think the Rams are really interesting because who's likely to throw a pick six? It's Joe Flacco. Who can't move around in the pocket? It's Joe Flacco. And then, man, like 4,700 left at tight end. So, yeah.
We can. I'm not married to these running backs too. Like if there's one of these, like if you want to upgrade Javonte or Warren, we could do that.
Well, and we could even get like really interesting and go, we could go David Njoku and Devin Singletary instead of Jaylen Warren. And that salary is going to work. We could also go like, or if we wanted to pull this a different way, like you go all the way down to Brevin Jordan, and then we've got 7,600, right? And then we could say like, well, we started this out trying to do a running back in the flex, but that doesn't mean we have to do that, right? We could go with like a Jalen Waddle or a Brandon Ayuk, or we could go with, there's so many different ways that we can finish off this roster, right? So this is a thought exercise. We can finish it however we want to here, but it's a really fun starting point on this roster. And kind of shows for those of you who've been watching, like the salary flexibility that is available this week. Like we didn't even go down to Zack Moss, and we still have this salary flexibility to be able to do some really interesting things.
Those are my favorite comments that I'll get after our practice builds, where someone will be like, pretty nice lineup, but you completely messed up not putting this guy in. Guess what? The beauty of DFS is you can make that perfect lineup where you steal 95% of our ideas and you bring it across the finish line in the way we were not able to do on Friday.
We could go Waddle here because you don't.
That's what I was gonna talk. I was just gonna bring that up and be like, let's talk about what that like mega game.
Because this is just saying like, okay, yeah, Tua in a double stack, Tua is going for like 32 to 35, but also in the game environment that pushes this, you can end up with Howell going for 30 at 2K less than salary, and then this becomes one of those games where Howell goes for 30, Samuel and Dotson combined for 30 to 35, which again they've done 3 out of their last 8 games together, and you get that Waddle and Hill. I mean, who else is going to have Waddle Hill like a double stack with, without going down to Zack Moss for that running back position? Again, Brevin Jordan going to be pretty low owned, I would think. So, really interesting build here.
What's fun, so I write my weekly piece for Fantasy Life Hidden Gems that's more directly catered to underdog drafts, but a couple of the things we did here were stuff I exactly wrote about for the drafts, and one of those was Sam Howell is going not drafted in a lot of those, and obviously Tua is going as the most popular quarterback, and saying like you can take Tyreek and Waddle, where you basically a lot of people who take Tyreek then just stack him with Tua, but it's like you could take Tyreek, Waddle, and then grab Sam Howell as a way to get access to both of those guys, and just say, hey, even if Sam Howell gives you what 80%, 85% of Tua's score, like you're going to be very, very happy getting access to both of those wide receivers.
Yeah, and I don't think this is one of those spots where you don't want to underrate how bad the Washington pass defense has been. Obviously, Jack Del Rio fired. They're going to try to change some things, but we're 12 weeks into the season. There's only so much you can change at this point in the season. So, this is the type of spot where a build like this could end up really making sense. And this game ends up being, obviously we expect Philadelphia, San Francisco to be high scoring, but this could be like higher scoring than all the other games. And this is just like the way to build on this type of slate.
One other thing about this lineup I want to ask you about, and then I'm heading over to the Badge Bros channel immediately following this. We're going to do Off and On the Clock, talk through this slate from an underdog draft perspective. I have the redirect set up here, so you don't even have to go anywhere. You just hit refresh, and I will magically appear on screen with the Badge Bros. But real quick about Jahan Dotson, because we were talking about the Commanders. It does seem like if you look at his splits, like his splits with Curtis Samuel in the lineup have been pretty poor. How do you think about Dotson, just even schematically with what this offense does, where Sam Howell likes to throw the ball?
I mean, he had his 27.6 point game with Sam Howell, with Curtis Samuel in the lineup, didn't he? I don't know. It's just, to me, this passing attack is a mystery to me. I haven't updated these numbers, right? But like as of I think heading into last week, Howell had like 24 pass attempts inside the 10, and they'd gone to 9 different players, and nobody had more than 5 targets inside the 10. So it's just like, it's just one of those offenses where, maybe it was inside the 20, but it's just one of those offenses where they're going to throw a lot. They spread the ball around more than you would like, but somebody's going to hit. So I tend to not overthink like my ability to project what's going to happen, because it's still all small sample size stuff. And so unless I find something from Reeves and Hilo on that Searching for Ceiling podcast that kind of tilts me more heavily in one particular direction, I'll kind of just look at this and say, mix and match these guys in a lot of different ways. And that's how I'll probably approach things.
I think that's right too, right? Whereas like if I was playing a Commanders wide receiver as a one-off in another thing, I probably am playing just the Curtis Samuel value. Like he's shown an ability to consistently earn targets, but like this lineup we just built, we are playing for the bonkers nutty. There's 70 points scored in this game, and that tide lifts all boats, and Jahan Dotson ends up being a big beneficiary, I think. So like that to me really tracks with how this specific lineup was constructed.
Yeah. And Josh Reynolds had a 24-pointer earlier this year where he had 66 yards and 2 touchdowns, right? Like Dotson can do something like that, where just the touchdowns, like you don't need to have a ton of catches, don't have a ton of yards, but just those touchdowns is what ends up elevating your score. So like you said, you bet on this massive game environment takeoff, then you just kind of bet on it and get some pieces on there.
Let the people know what they can expect if they head over and check out 1 week season tonight. We're going to get the scroll, all of that stuff populated. Pete 70 will get you 70% off. If they take the plunge, what will they see over there tonight?
Yeah, we'll get the player grid up, my whole player pool. You'll get my Sunday morning update as well. If you're an Inner Circle member, you get my Bink Machine breakdown, which is all of my player groups and rules in the optimizer. So even if you're not using an optimizer, you kind of get my breakdown of how I'm putting my rosters together on that particular week. And then, Hilo's end around strategy breakdown. You guys watched Hilo on here a couple of weeks ago. Super sharp guy. Player pools from other guys, strategy updates and breakdowns from other guys. That Pete code still gets you 20% off a week pass, gets you 20% off Props Insider, gets you 20% off the Bink Machine optimizer, which is down to $59 for the rest of the season. So lots of cool stuff to check out. And hopefully we will see you over there.
Yeah. Appreciate all of you. Come hang out with us over on the Badge Bros channel. Come hang out with us in the Deposit Kingdom Discord. Next time you see me on this channel will be Saturday night for DFS After Dark with Sack Religious. Hope you guys all have a great week 13. Let's take down some tournaments. We'll see you guys next time on the Block Party Show with Pete and JM.